Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into one of history's absolute most dramatic power transitions. We're looking at the tragic, really steady fall of King Saul and the completely improbable rise of a shepherd boy named David. Let's just jump right in. Now, before we get into the really gritty battles and all the betrayals, we kind of have to stop and ask ourselves, how did this monumental shift in power actually happen? And, maybe more importantly, what does this whole transition reveal about the inner character of these two wildly different men? Just look at the sheer contrast between these two figures. On one side, we have David, this small harpist, totally filled with the Spirit of the Lord, just trying to soothe his king. And looming right over him is Saul, a towering monarch gripped by absolute paranoia, tormented by an evil spirit, and literally ready to hurl his spear at any given moment. All right, let's get into section 1, a tale of two kings and the diverging paths of Israel's leaders. So, Saul's downfall? It definitely didn't happen overnight. It really started with some pretty blatant disobedience. There were two huge defining moments here. First, he makes this presumptuous sacrifice at Gilgal because he was impatient and completely bypassed the prophet Samuel. And second, he fails to fully deal with the Amalekites. He actually chooses to keep the best livestock and spare the enemy king, even though he had crystal clear commands to do the exact opposite. And this brings up a really provocative question. Why in the world did Saul lose his kingdom so quickly for a premature sacrifice, while David, a guy who later commits adultery and murder, was actually given time to repent? I mean, at first glance, it feels entirely unequal, right? It really forces us to examine how we measure the severity of a failure versus the inner posture of the person actually making it. Which brings us to section 2, the heart and the spirit, humility versus pride. Well, the answer really lies in their humility. God actually explicitly states that he is looking for a man after his own heart. David's ability to humbly recognize his utter wrongs and genuinely repent is a massive contrast to Saul. Saul was practically obsessed with covering up his mistakes, justifying his disobedience, and literally building monuments to his own honor. This kind of pure heart posture is captured so beautifully by the Hebrew word hesed. It essentially means a deep, covenant friendship and loyal love. And we see this demonstrated perfectly between David and, ironically enough, Saul's own son, Jonathan. Just think about the magnitude of that for a second. Jonathan sacrificed his own royal future, willingly giving up his direct path to the throne, simply to protect David through hesed. Moving right along to section 3, wilderness and warfare, the crucible of the future king. Here's the really wild thing to think about. Literally nothing in David's life was wasted. Every seemingly insignificant or brutal moment was preparation. I mean, from his youth slinging rocks at lions to protect his sheep, which, by the way, perfectly prepared him to slay Goliath in the Elah Valley, to fleeing through these barren wadis and governing a regional town like Ziklag, it was the exact training he needed to eventually govern a really volatile nation. But look, we have to be honest here. His time in the wilderness wasn't just some triumphant hero's training montage. It was fraught with agonizing tragedy. Desperate and on the run from Saul, David goes to Nob and actually lies to the priest Ahimelech just to get some consecrated bread and Goliath's old sword. Well, an informant named Dog the Edomite sees this whole thing and reports straight back to Saul. In a blind fit of total paranoia, Saul ruthlessly orders the massacre of all the priests at Nob. And David? He deeply, personally felt the devastating weight of that lie. But incredibly, even out of this absolute nightmare, Providence steps in. One priest, Abiathar, manages to escape the slaughter. He flees right to David, and he brings with him the sacred ephod. Inside that ephod are the Urim and Thummim. Guys, this is massive because it grants David the vital ability to inquire directly of the Lord for military and spiritual guidance. It's a direct lifeline to God that King Saul has completely, totally forfeited. It's a super volatile time, and David is literally being pushed to his absolute limits on the run. At one point, a wealthy but very foolish man named Nabal insults him, and David nearly marches out to slaughter the guy. But Nabal's wife, the beautiful and highly intelligent Abigail, intercepts him. She prophesies David's lasting dynasty and wisely talks him down, totally preventing him from staining his hands with needless innocent blood. And David, showing that humble heart we talked about, actually listens to her correction. All right, section 4, geopolitics and Philistine threats, the real-world danger. Now, we have to remember that the Israelites weren't just operating in a vacuum here.
Sitting right on the coast were 5 major Philistine cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. This wasn't just some disorganized army. It was a massive, cosmopolitan military machine that was constantly muscling its way into the vulnerable Israelite hill country through natural buffer zones, like the Elah Valley. So, to survive this absolute geopolitical nightmare, David ends up playing a remarkably astute and, let's be honest, somewhat deceptive political game. In a brilliant stroke of irony, he actually takes refuge with the very enemy he used to fight. The Philistine king Achish of Gath gives David the town of Ziklag. While he's there, David acts as a sort of sheriff, overseeing these vital, super lucrative, ancient spice trade routes through the Negev desert. But he pulls this massive ruse. He tells the Philistine king he's raiding Israelite towns, when in reality, he's wiping out Israel's nomadic enemies, secretly protecting Judah's borders, and storing up massive political capital for his future.
And that sets the stage for Section 5, the tragedy at Endor, a king's desperate final hours. Just think about the sheer desperation of Saul's final gamble here. The Philistines are swarming Mount Gilboa like locusts. God is entirely silent. No prophets, no dreams, no Urim and Thummim. Pushed right to the brink of madness, Saul takes a massive risk. He sneaks out in disguise right behind enemy lines in the dead of night, heading to a town called Endor. So there he is in Endor, right? And he actually consults a medium, completely hypocritically breaking his own strict laws against witchcraft. When she conducts the seance, she lets out this piercing shriek of sheer terror. She claims she sees an Elohim, a supernatural, godlike apparition rising straight up from the earth. That apparition turns out to be the deceased prophet Samuel, and the medium immediately realizes she's been tricked by King Saul himself. And what Samuel delivers from beyond the grave is just terrifying. He tells Saul, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy?" Samuel confirms the tragic reality. God has permanently torn the kingdom from Saul because of his continued, hard-hearted disobedience. And the most chilling part of it all, Samuel prophesies that by tomorrow, Saul and his sons will be dead. And guys, the very next day, this dark prophecy becomes a stark, bloody reality. Mortally wounded in battle on Mount Gilboa, Saul takes his own life, falling right on his own sword. The Israelite army completely scatters in a blind panic, abandoning their homes, and the Philistines march right in and occupy their towns. It is just utter and complete devastation. Ultimately, wrapping up this explainer, we're really left with something heavy to chew on. Look at the ashes of Saul's reign. What are the true, lasting consequences of a leader's hardened, unrepentant heart? And as we finally close the chapter on Saul, we really have to wonder, how in the world will David, this former shepherd boy and fugitive, ever be able to rebuild the completely shattered, overrun kingdom that he literally just inherited?